8. Migrants flee Cuba in stolen helicopter. When the Soviet Union collapsed, it was no longer able to give Cuba the generous economic assistance the country had grown reliant on. Cuba then plunged into a severe financial crisis called the Special Period, which started in 1991 and lasted for almost an entire decade. Things that were once readily available, including food and crude oil, were suddenly scarce and hard to come by, triggering an energy crisis and widespread malnourishment among citizens. During the first 3 years of the Special Period, tens of thousands of Cuban refugees sought asylum in the States. Most came by sea, but in 1992, one group arrived in a stolen Mi-8 helicopter. The pilot, a former Cuban Air Force lieutenant named German Pompa, took the chopper from the country's tourism sector with the help of 2 other defectors. They flew to a field where 31 relatives crammed onto the Mi-8 with their luggage, despite its carrying capacity of just 21 people. Pompa flew the helicopter at a low altitude to avoid getting detected by Cuban radar. Toward the end of the 80-minute journey, the American military saw the chopper and dispatched an aircraft to intercept it. After deeming that the helicopter was not a threat, the aircraft escorted it to Miami Airport outside Miami, where the migrants were greeted by waiting family members who had already made it to the US. The migrants were taken to an immigration processing center and were soon released under a federal law that grants special residency to refugees. 7. The largest helicopter ever built. In 1959, the Soviet Union conducted design studies for a massive helicopter capable of lifting 22 to 28 tons. The chopper was supposed to have a similar carrying capacity to the Antonov An-22 turboprop plane, but be able to take off and land without a runway, enabling equipment delivery in hard-to-reach places. Dubbed the Mil V-12, 2 prototypes were built. The 92-foot-long fuselage was made of 2 levels, with the lower-level cockpit used by the pilot, co-pilot, and engineer, while the radio operator and other crew occupied the upper level. In addition to its ability to lift heavy loads, the V-12 had a large cargo space, thanks to the powerful turboshaft engines that propelled its 15-foot rotor blades. The V-12 prototype flew successfully in 1968. It set 2 load-carrying records the next year, when it lifted 34 tons to an altitude of 9,682 feet, and again when it lifted 44 tons up to 7,398 feet. The chopper was revealed to the West for the first time during the 1971 Paris Air Show and was met with talk of the possibility of turning it into a passenger aircraft to carry almost 196 people. But the V-12 never left the prototype stage and was eventually cancelled in favor of the Mil Mi-26, the largest and most powerful helicopter in serial production. 6. A man saves his family. In 1975, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces. Knowing that his family would be executed or put into a forced labor camp, 35-year-old South Vietnamese Air Force Major Ba Van Nguyen stole a Chinook helicopter and smuggled 11 of his loved ones onto it. The bullet-riddled helicopter had little fuel, and Nguyen had no experience flying over bodies of water, but he decided to take his chances. While flying over the South China Sea, he spotted the American naval destroyer escort USS Kirk. There wasn't enough room to land on the deck, but the captain let him hover over the ship so his family could reach safety. After dropping them off, he flew out over the open water, put the chopper in a hover position, and jumped out, ditching the aircraft into the sea. Nguyen vanished below the water as a stream of red liquid popped up, and for a few moments the Kirk's crew worried he'd been lost. But he soon popped up above the surface and was greeted by cheers from the ship, who quickly rescued him. The red liquid in the water turned out to be hydraulic fluid. 35 years later, Nguyen and his family reunited with the Kirk's captain and crew, and he received a long-overdue Air Service Medal for his heroic actions. 5. Prisoner escapes by helicopter. French prisoner Pascal Payet was 6 years into a 30-year murder sentence when he made his 3rd escape attempt in 2007. Both of his previous escapes were done with help from the outside. He had men hijack helicopters and force pilots to fly to the prison. They picked up Payette and flew him to a destination of his choosing, then let the victims go. Deemed a major flight risk, Payette never stayed in one prison longer than 6 months at a time, and staff kept an eye on him constantly, but he was determined to get out. His unconventional escape method had worked twice in the past, so Payette decided to use it again. 4 of his accomplices hijacked a helicopter in Cannes and flew 20 minutes to the prison. They had the pilot land the chopper on the facility's roof, and in less than 5 minutes broke Payette out. A short while later, they had the pilot land and they fled on foot. Payette's third break at freedom didn't last long. Just 2 months after escaping, he was captured with 2 accomplices outside Barcelona. He was taken back to prison and kept under even tighter restrictions, and authorities refused to disclose his location to the general public. It's unclear whether he tried to escape again, but if he did, it wasn't successful. Payette was paroled in 2019 and is now free, out living in the world. If you thought you could escape from prison, would you try it or finish your sentence? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 4. The Mind Heist. During the 1980s, the Soviet Union developed an attack helicopter called the Mi-24. At the time, American helicopters lacked the offensive capabilities of the heavily armed Mi-25, which could transport 8 fully equipped troops and give air support during battle. After hearing about the chopper's use in the Ethiopia and Afghanistan conflicts, both the CIA and British intelligence sought to learn as much as they could. They got their chance in 1987 during an informal war battle between Chad and Libya. During the skirmish, Chad's forces pushed invading Libyan troops back from the country's territory. The Libyans left behind an Mi-25, and the CIA brokered an agreement with Chad for its removal in a mission labeled Mount Hope 3. To keep the operation as covert as possible, the CIA got help from the US Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Also known as the Night Stalkers, this group specializes in nighttime operations and has carried out some of the most difficult and complex operations in all of military history. The Night Stalkers were the perfect candidates for stealing the Mi-25 under the cover of darkness, which they accomplished using 2 modified Chinook helicopters. They pulled the mission off perfectly, and the 3 aircraft were loaded onto an airlift jet and flown to the US for study. 3. Pilot versus polar bears. Russian sociologist, journalist and adventurer Sergei Ananov was halfway through a helicopter flight from Canada to Greenland in 2015 when he had sudden mechanical issues. His rotor blades lost half their power and he started descending rapidly. Ananov knew he couldn't save the flight and that his attempt to become the first person to circumnavigate the globe in a helicopter weighing less than a ton was about to end. He knew he was in serious danger as he came closer and closer to the freezing cold water below. In an article he later wrote for the BBC, he described how he guided the aircraft into a forced landing in the water. It sank in less than 30 seconds, taking Ananov's satellite phone, distress beacon, and trackers to the bottom of the ocean while he swam to a large chunk of ice. Ananov was wearing a survival suit, but it had gotten waterlogged and he was starting to freeze. He blew up his life raft and used it to partially shield himself from the harsh Arctic wind. The conditions were so dire that it became exhausting for Ananov to get up and move. And with less than a liter of water and just a few protein bars, threats of hunger and thirst were imminent. For 32 hours, Ananov wondered whether he'd die from the cold, hunger, or at the hands of hungry polar bears, which he saw repeatedly while stranded on the small block of ice. The prospect of not surviving became more realistic when he failed to get the attention of 2 planes that passed overhead. Finally, he spotted a Canadian Coast Guard cutter off in the distance. Unlike the 2 passing aircraft, the crew noticed Ananov's distress flare and dispatched a helicopter to save him. He was surprised to learn that the ship was looking for him after learning of his disappearance, and said that the crew was extremely shocked that he was coherent, able to walk, and not in dire need of medical help. Ananov was grateful to his rescuers and for the warm shower, food, and comfortable bed he received on the cutter. Above all, though, he was moved by the extraordinary kindness people around the world showed toward him throughout his flight journey. Upon parting ways, the Coast Guard crew that rescued Ananov gifted him a stuffed polar bear to remember them by. Even after his close brush with death, he said he planned to make another attempt at circumnavigating the globe in a small helicopter, but that he hadn't yet figured out how to break the news to his friends and family. 2. Future music star steals helicopter. Before he became one of country music's most iconic singers, Kris Kristofferson followed in his family's footsteps and joined the US military, eventually becoming an Army Ranger and helicopter pilot. But he didn't want to make a career out of it, so he left the service. He received an honorable discharge, but his family disowned him for the decision. Kristofferson later moved to Nashville to pursue his dream of becoming a musician. Like many, he found himself working low-paying odd jobs just to make ends meet while being burdened by increasing expenses. He knew that if he could just get discovered, he could make it in the business, so he set his sights on getting his demo tape to the hands of Johnny Cash. The aspiring singer gave one of his tapes to June Carter Cash and asked her to give it to her husband. She actually did, but it landed in the large pile of tapes Johnny Cash received from people hoping to make it big in the music industry. When Kristofferson failed to get a response from the superstar, he made a plan B for getting himself noticed. While working as a pilot for an oil firm in 1965, he stole a helicopter and flew it to Johnny and June's property. They weren't home when he got there, but the stunt certainly got their attention. Cash finally listened to the demo tape, and he liked it enough to produce Kristofferson's first single. His fame quickly grew, and he now has a successful career as a country legend. 1. An heir escapes by air. In 1962, New York businessman and heir to his family's fortune, Joel David Kaplan, was sentenced to serve 28 years in a Mexican prison for killing his business partner. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial, claiming the body used against him in the case did not belong to the victim and that he was set up. After the truth failed and he found himself unable to bribe his way to freedom, Kaplan tried to escape several times. 9 years into his sentence, he bought a helicopter and summoned it to the prison while almost all the other inmates and guards were busy with a movie screening. After realizing that there was a chopper landing in the exercise yard, staff initially assumed the Attorney General was just paying a surprise visit. It was no coincidence that the aircraft was painted to resemble the man's own helicopter. Kaplan and a fellow inmate, Carlos Antonio Contreras Castro, then slipped into the chopper and were whisked away before employees realized what was even happening. From there, Kaplan transferred to a plane that was also bought and registered in his name and flew to Brownsville, Texas. He went straight into hiding, but not for the reasons you'd think. The US government had no interest in arresting him, and even Mexico didn't seem too determined to put him back into custody. In fact, the man Kaplan hired to mastermind the breakout, Victor Estanta, told the New York Times that there was a loophole in Mexico's laws that only made a prison escape illegal if the escapee used violent means to flee. Stanta insisted that not a single law was broken during Kaplan's return to the States. But the escape was highly publicized, and Kaplan wanted to protect his safety and privacy. He lived out the rest of his years quietly and out of the watchful public eye. Thanks for watching. Which one of these helicopter stories surprised you the most? Tell us in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.